Well, welcome everyone. My name is Robin Ryan, coordinator of the Seeds of Partnership, and along with us is Dana Egan, program specialist. And on behalf of the Seeds of Partnership team, we'd like to welcome you to this webinar, Partnerships and New Possibilities with Families, which has a special education focus. This is the first of a two-part webinar. Today's segment will be on building alliances with families and promoting partnerships. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the California Department of Education, CDE, for funding our project to provide statewide resources and professional development opportunities. Next slide. Just a little bit about Seeds of Partnership. Our project is funded through the Special Education Division and is under the auspices of the Sacramento County Office of Education. This project supports various CDE statewide initiatives and activities, including monitoring requirements and improvement, family engagement, youth leadership, early learning, and statewide coordinated assistance to the family empowerment centers. It's related to the IDEA Part B preschool, LRE, and parent involvement, as well as Part C family outcomes. SEEDS partners with CDE and related contracts and projects in an effort to improve outcomes for students with disabilities infant through secondary transition. A few reminders before we get started. We are recording the webinar. It will be available to those who've registered, and we will be posting it on our Seeds of Partnership website. Please complete the brief survey that's at the end of the presentation. We will post the link in the chat. As a participant, you should see at the bottom of your screen the chat button. We encourage you to participate through the session. You will also see a Q&A. So if you have questions, please use that feature because we will plan to capture all the questions. This webinar series is sponsored by Seeds of Partnership and the CDE Special Education Division and the Family Engagement Department. And at this time, I'd like to introduce the California Department of Education Family Engagement Director, Lisa Borrego, for a brief welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. As mentioned, my name is Lisa Borrego, and I'm the Director of Family Engagement for the California Department of Education. It's my pleasure to be here welcoming you all and excited to share the newly formed Office of Family and Community Engagement here at the California Department of Ed. We're excited to partner with the Seeds of Partnership and with our Special Education Division to co-support this work and future webinars as well. I definitely want to make sure that you're aware that our priority is to engage families as partners and to encourage our LEAs to continue their efforts in reaching families to work together to meet the needs of students in whatever form that may look like. And so we're excited to bring this resource along with future resources to you and look forward to continued partnership. Again, I'd like to thank the Seeds of Partnership, Robin, and Dana for the work that they're doing, and we look forward to our continued work with them and look forward to hearing the presenter today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. We definitely appreciate the opportunity to team with you and your department. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. A.Pleet-Odle. One of the cornerstones of our project's work over the last several decades is inclusion of children with disabilities. We first learned of Dr. Pleet-Odle through her book, Included with the End in Mind, and then had the opportunity to attend her session at one of the National Family and Community Engagement Conferences, where she was one of the few speaking about engagement of families involved in special education. That was several years ago, and we've continued to follow Amy since then and her deep connection to the work. Amy's been an educator for more than 50 years in multiple roles in education. She's been a part of numerous initiatives that have created lasting change in the lives of students with disabilities, the professionals who work with them, and their families. Great to have you with us today, Amy.
Thank you, Robin, for those kind words. I have to say how excited I am to begin this work with the local schools and the districts and with the Seeds of Partnership in California. It's a topic I am passionate about personally, as you will hear in some of the stories that I'm about to share with you. The intended outcomes for this two-part webinar are: explore the options to promote family partnerships for students with special education needs, learn more about the dual capacity building framework for family partnerships and implications of the Endrew F Supreme Court ruling for local practice, And third, use the 10 tips for family alliances to determine local opportunities to expand partnerships. So that's pretty ambitious. We're going to be covering all of those 3 outcomes in part 1 and part 2. We'll tell you more about part 2 later. Let me tell you a little more about where I'm coming from. I started as an English teacher before there was a special ed law. Robin said I've been working as an educator for more than 50 years, and it's true. Of course, I started when I was 6. No. I didn't know then, when I was an English teacher, that some kids weren't supposed to learn. I figured it was up to me to find a way to reach everybody. I brought that attitude into my later work as a special ed teacher and a team chair. But then I became a transition specialist at the district and then at the state level. In the year 2000, I left my position as the Maryland State Transition Specialist to enter a tenure track position at Towson University in Maryland. In my 6 years there, I co-created the graduate program and retired as associate professor and graduate director. I learned something profound during those years. It was challenging to ensure that the CEC competencies, the Council for Exceptional Children competencies for special educators, were embedded in all the courses so that when teacher candidates graduated, prepared for certification, they were ready to design differentiated and universally designed learning, use behavior management strategies, and work collaboratively with colleagues and families, plus foster youth development and empowerment. Meanwhile, I was a parent. After sitting at the IEP table as a parent, I had personal reasons for those teacher candidates to develop key competencies. Then I went to the University of Delaware as a secondary inclusion consultant. Part of my responsibility put me back in classrooms supporting teachers. I couldn't leave behind what I had learned. I couldn't focus only on inclusion. I worked with teachers and leaders to braid together inclusion, youth self-efficacy, transition planning, behavior self-regulation, and family partnerships. We can't expect teachers to figure out how everything fits together if we can't do it in the leadership and the professional development world. So here's my family now, just in case you're interested. 3 of the people in this picture have doctorates. 2 had IEPs when they were in school, and 3 are using ADA accommodations now. And I'm not talking about the dog. I created a 1-pager for this workshop to summarize all 10 tips that you can download with this link, amypleet.com/10 tips. And I'll ask Robin to put that in the chat. You can download it as a Word document or a Google document, and you can share with your colleagues. You'll notice that the second page has a strategic planning tool so you can jot your thoughts as we go along. I'm going to discuss each of the tips, illustrating with stories and examples. If any of you are watching today with collaborators who work with you in the same school, you can share a copy with them and complete it collaboratively, or watch the replay together later and complete the strategic planning tool at that time. The great thing about the replay is you'll be able to pause and talk whenever you want. You can't pause me. I'm going to keep talking. So who's in? Write yes in the chat. Give me a thumbs up if you think your school needs to dig into this. Do we need to do something strategic about family engagement? I see some yeses showing up. Thank you. Now, while you're accessing the tool, I'd like to make a recommendation about how to use it. I was able to tune in and hear Michelle Brooks when she was part of the Seeds in Sacramento County Office event, and the districts that work with her to expand their family engagement. I really liked the tool she shared for local strategic planning, but what I liked best was she used a problem of practice approach, which is what we often use with teachers when we're teaching them to implement universal design for learning. Eventually, you'll want your family partnerships to be systematic and embedded in every aspect of the IEP process, but it's not practical to change everything at once, nor is it humane. We humans just can't tolerate that much change all at once, especially now when we've been through so much in the last year and a half. So I suggest you listen to me today to get a broad perspective, and then sit down with Michelle Brooks' tool or another strategic planning tool and select one problem of practice. Think, what would you like to improve in the way that you interact with families within the special education world? How could partnerships with families increase your own effectiveness? Now, before we get into the 10 tips I promised you, let's follow the advice on this slide. Ask why before how. I'm curious, write in the chat why we should partner with families of students with disabilities. Why build partnerships with families whose children have special education needs? Why open that can of worms, as a principal once asked me? Why go to the trouble to examine our standard current operating procedures now? Why make changes? We know change is disruptive for everyone, so why bother? I see. For everyone's success. Yeah, okay, you're reading my mind. Anything in particular? Build relationships. Families are often isolated because students' needs are so different. That is true. Effective communication, build trust. Oh, look, you're singing the song. We need to help parents understand the possibilities. Often they truly don't know what they don't know. Parents are their voice. Ooh, okay. This is great. So let me start with the big picture. The purpose of special education is to prepare children to be productive citizens, right? So how are we doing as a nation? This graph shows data from the US Department of Labor. The blue line reflects the employment of non-disabled adults over 16 in this country. It doesn't display the impact of the pandemic, but you'll see the line fluctuate between 62% and 70% employment rate from 2008 to 2020. 2008 was the first year that national data was collected on the employment of adults with disabilities. That's the red line. Do you see it is hovering in the 20% range? Think about it. All the work we've done over the years with special education and secondary transition service and vocational rehabilitation. That means if we don't do something, 1 in 5 of your current students with disabilities, whether they have an IEP or a 504 plan, 1 in 5 will be employed. These data include part-time employment too. That's not okay with me, and I bet it's not okay with you. We've worked too hard to allow this trend to continue. So what can we do? You may know that the federal government funded the second National Longitudinal Transition Study following 2,000 youth with disabilities over 10 years. The youth were between 13 and 16. They all had disabilities in 2000 when the study began. There have been lots of analysis and reports generated by the findings. I'm most interested in the article by Sjogren and colleagues. They reviewed the NLTS2 data and they reported that up to 8 years after the youth exited school, up to 8 years after they exited, their autonomy, self-realization, and psychological empowerment predict post-school outcomes. And psychological empowerment showed a strong relationship with employment wages and benefits. There are many other names for psychological empowerment. In the special education world, we call it self-determination, taking an active rather than a passive role in your own life and becoming a causal agent. In other words, supporting students to get behind the wheel. We want this for all our students, but students with disabilities have an extra layer. As they develop, they need to develop skills in self-awareness, understanding their own disabilities, understanding their learning challenges, and knowing their strengths. And they need to learn to self-advocate if they need information presented in a different format, or they need to engage in a learning process in a different way. So what does the research show? It shows many students with IEPs exit high school without awareness of their disability, without knowledge of civil rights, without registering for disability supports in higher ed. So they don't get the supports they need. And many don't know how to advocate for the protections they could have under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Teachers, therapists, transition coordinators, and school personnel can't do this alone. We need to form alliances with families to support youth skill development in our children, starting young, all the way through to graduation. As most of you probably know, each state and local education agency is monitored for compliance with IDEA using 17 indicators. Which of these indicators could be impacted by expanding the effectiveness of your family alliances? I started to highlight a few. As a transition specialist, in my background, I thought of graduation rate, dropout rate, post-school outcomes. And then I thought, well, of course, the parent involvement one could be impacted, and dispute resolution. If families are aligned with this, there'd be fewer disputes. And then I thought about least restrictive environment, preschool LRE, preschool outcomes. There were only a few left, and it didn't take me long to think of a role families could play to improve those too. As you're watching this webinar, think about the indicator that could make the greatest difference in your location. Where would you like to start in building partnerships with families? So, who benefits when we forge effective alliances with families of students with disabilities? First, the student benefits because school personnel and families work together to strengthen his or her skills to become a successful student and a productive adult, especially if we're united in fostering each student's development as a causal agent. Second, families benefit because they can join forces with school personnel and reinforce school-sponsored initiatives. They decrease that sense of isolation, and they have the long-term benefit of positive post-school outcomes. After that student successfully graduates and becomes self-supporting, this can happen if we work together. And third, you benefit. Teachers and support personnel have an increased sense of satisfaction knowing families have their back, knowing their efforts are being reinforced from home. You know what I'm talking about. Maybe you've only had a few isolated experiences, or maybe this is your normal. We'll hear examples of successful alliances from our panel during this second part of this webinar series. So when's the best time to roll up your sleeves to intentionally examine your current practices and plan strategically? Think about all we've learned in the last year and a half from the pandemic shutdown. Teachers and school leaders everywhere realized they couldn't simply tell parents, send your students to us and we'll take it from there. Students were at home with parents hovering nearby or trying to work in the next room. Everyone got to peek behind the curtain and our eyes were opened. We needed parents then and we need parents now. This is the time. I invite you to start today. Use this webinar to consider what you already have in place that's working. And if it's working, please don't change it, but also consider, is it working for everybody? What barriers are stopping families, teachers, and leaders from forging powerful alliances? What don't you know right now that could alter what's possible for you, your families, and most importantly, the students in your care? Let's start with a proven framework for building partnerships with all families. You may know that the U.S. Department of Education announced this second version of the dual capacity building framework in 2019. It was created by Dr. Karen Mapp of Harvard to provide a compass schools can use to increase the capacity of educators and families to build strong partnerships aimed at student and school improvement for all students. You'll find a wealth of resources on the dualcapacity.org website aimed at building partnerships for all families. I understand some of you have worked directly with Karen Mapp and Michelle Brooks on establishing some new practices locally for family partnerships. That's a great foundation for the work we will be doing. If you haven't had the opportunity, though, of working with either of those awesome ladies, that will be okay, because I've built this framework into my approach, so I don't think you'll feel lost. Now let's jump to the capacity outcomes. What will we achieve if we've successfully developed dual capacity? What's the point of family partnerships? Why bother? Do you notice the design, the two pieces, the red and the blue, fit together like pieces of a puzzle, the educators and the families? That's no accident. They belong together. There have been more than 50 years of research demonstrating that when you have built strong school-family partnerships, these outcomes are achieved. Let's look at them in detail. With strong partnerships, educators, that's the blue part, are empowered to connect family engagement to learning and development. They engage families as co-creators and honor family funds of knowledge. They're empowered to create welcoming cultures for families and students. At the same time, families are empowered, and that's the orange part, to engage in diverse roles to support student learning, such as co-creators, supporters, encouragers, monitors, advocates, and models. We'll talk about some of these roles in this presentation and at the next part. Are these outcomes worth the effort? I can tell you, no matter which hat I put on, my parent hat, my teacher hat, my transition coordinator hat, my consultant hat, or my citizen hat, I think the answer is yes. The framework begins with a challenge educators and families face. Does this fit with experiences in your school? Based on years of research, the framework states the biggest challenges for educators are that they've not been exposed to strong examples of family engagement. They've received minimal training on building partnerships, and they may not see partnership as an essential practice. And they may have developed deficit mindsets, only viewing families through the problems they present. The challenges for families include not having strong examples of family engagement, and many have had negative past experiences with school and educators, perhaps related to their child's disability. They may not feel invited to contribute to their child's education, and they may feel disrespected, unheard, and unvalued. For our discussion today, let's expand the meaning of educators to include counselors, support therapists, administrators, transition specialists, and vocational rehabilitation and higher ed disability support personnel. And when we're talking about families, let's include not only biological and foster parents, but also aunts, uncles, grandparents, siblings, those families that are immigrants and non-English speaking. Now, I could do a whole workshop on just this purple part to help schools and organizations to set up the process conditions and the organizational conditions to move forward. Are these process conditions currently present in your school or organizational culture? Think what it would take in your school and your organization to have every interaction between families and practitioners built on mutual trust, culturally responsive, and respectful, collaborative, and interactive. What if within this special education process, families viewed professionals and professionals viewed families through an asset-based lens, appreciating the assets that each brought to the table rather than the deficits to be overcome? Picture having these conditions in every interaction, starting with that first welcoming contact through IEP meetings, all communications, and progress reports. We have some work to do. And then the framework lists the important organizational conditions, the procedures, policies, and resources. Is partnership with families woven through all your policies? Is family voice present when these organizational conditions are reviewed and updated? How about student voice? And are families given resources they need as partners in a systemic way? Now, remember, this is called the dual capacity building framework. That means we want to expand the capacity of both professionals and families. My 10 tips focus on what professionals can do to build alliances with families. That doesn't mean I don't value building capacities of families. I believe we need to start with professionals. Their capacity will greatly influence their interactions with families. The framework urges us to expand dual capacity in the 4 C's. First, capabilities. What capabilities do families and professionals need to build partnerships? Second, connections. Who do they need to be connected to? 3, cognition. What shifts in values and beliefs do they need in order for partnerships to be successful? And finally, confidence. What actions can they take that will build their confidence to continue building a partnership with the school? My hope is that as professionals practice these 10 tips, they will build all these capacities and support families to build corresponding capacities at the same time. Karen Mapp often says that the dual capacity building framework is a compass, not a roadmap. It doesn't lay out the road you should follow to foster strong partnerships. You start where you are and use the parts of the framework to identify aspects that are missing so you can get yourself onto the right road. The framework is being used by schools and districts all over the country to forge effective partnerships with families. For example, Raquel Jimenez of Oakland Unified School District shared this slide in a recent webinar. She said they reinforce these 4 core beliefs in every professional development session. They believe all parents have dreams for their children and want the best for them. All parents can support their children's learning. Partnerships with families are essential for academic achievement, and the responsibility for building partnerships between school and home rests with all staff, including the principal. I love these, and the first 2 core beliefs could be restated by what's sometimes called the least dangerous assumption. When you're making an assumption about the families you work with, do you take the least dangerous assumption and assume that they want the best for their children and they are doing the best they can to support their children? Now, we're ready for the 10 tips. The first 3 focus on mindset. First, seek to understand the family's concerns. Second, listen like you care. And third, assume the best intentions. These are all easier said than done. Of course, the proof is in what your families think, not what you think about how you're doing. You know how it goes. If your spouse says you don't listen and you think you do, if your partner believes that he or she's not being heard, well, you get it. Let me illustrate with a story. I'm going to tell a story of School A and School B. School A was the middle school my son attended when he was first diagnosed on the autism spectrum. I served as the transition coordinator for this team, so I'd been to many, many IEP team meetings. On this day, I was the parent. Tom greeted me at the door. I changed his name to protect his identity. And he asked me to wait outside until they were ready for the meeting. What? I'd always been allowed in the meeting before, while everyone was assembling. Wasn't I a member of the team? And why didn't he call me Amy like he always did? He called me Mrs. Pleet. Then, when he did allow me to enter, he directed me to sit in the parent seat. What? He didn't assign seats for anyone else. I noticed the psychologist and the counselor weren't present. The purpose of this meeting was to share the results of my son's assessment to determine whether he qualified for special education service. So they were pretty important members of the team. Tom said, "Let's get started. We have limited time on the schedule." And then he said, "We usually start with documenting parent concerns," and I knew exactly where he was going to write on that IEP form. But I looked around that table at people I'd worked with for years, and I spoke the unforgivable words. I said, "I'd rather wait until the psychologist and counselor can join us." Why are they unforgivable? Well, I had been the IEP team leader, and I had participated in hundreds, maybe thousands of IEP meetings by that time. I knew how the schedule worked. I knew that if our meeting ran over, that English teacher wouldn't have coverage for her next class. And I knew there'd be another parent waiting for the next IEP meeting, which would start late. And I knew 3 members of the team might have to miss their lunch if we ran late. But as I looked around the table, I also knew there was only one person who would absolutely advocate for my son. Only one person who knew his whole history, and only one person who would be with him for the rest of his life after school. If I didn't speak up for him today, I would always regret it. I had to take off my professional hat, put on my mother hat, and summon my courage to speak up. Well, Tom wasn't happy about it, and nobody spoke or made eye contact until the counselor and psychologist joined us, eons later, or so it felt. His attitude was obvious as he reviewed the components of the IEP. They reviewed the evaluation and determined, yes, he did qualify, and he had already drafted goals. I noticed there were IEP goals for reading and one for math, but none for behavior or social interaction. I questioned that since by that time my son was reading at the 12th grade level. Why a reading goal? We always have a reading goal, he told me. Then I asked if we could have a goal for learning appropriate social interactions with peers. The next moment was strongly imprinted in my memory. Look, he said, I've already printed out this IEP for signatures. Are you asking for a revision? I couldn't believe it. Special Ed 101 fact, the IEP is draft until the team discusses it. This was the IEP team. Wasn't the IEP still a draft? Now, folks, I was working on my doctorate. In special ed at the time, I was knowledgeable. I decided this was the moment to interrupt the flow, but not all families would have that courage or that knowledge. Now, School B was a different story. It didn't look like this, but it sure felt like this. A one-room schoolhouse where the teachers truly knew my son way beyond a number and a set of test scores. They took time to listen. They engaged in regular communication with me. They remembered what we talked about the last time. They shared good news and bad. They asked my perspectives and we planned together. It's not what they did, it's the mindset they brought to their actions. They truly listened to me like they cared. And I believe they did care. It was obvious in so many little actions they took. There were times when School B was not in compliance with IDEA guidelines, but I didn't care. We were in communication and they had my son's interests at heart. There was no way I would consider filing a complaint. But School A, I seriously considered taking legal action several times, but it was complicated by my position on that same team. Schools that want to reduce litigation should start with mindset and build caring relationships with families. School B operated from this Maya Angelou quote. I'm sure you've heard it. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. How about tip 3? Assume the best intentions. This Stephen Covey quote is great. Listen with the intent to understand, not the intent to reply. So when we have that intent, I know what that parent's about to say. I know how to respond to them. We may want to pause and really listen and give them the benefit of the doubt. Give them the benefit of assuming the best intentions. When you're looking for a place to start with expanding partnerships, why plan for the families you know? Why not plan for the ones who are not showing up? Who are the ones that are missing? When you're planning, ask yourself, what are the barriers to their engagement? Consider how you could find out rather than assuming that you already know, and start with your own data. Now, there's another layer of getting to know families whose children have disabilities and other special needs that we need to consider. Again, I'm going to tell you a personal story that will resonate with some of you who are parents. Over the years, teachers had approached me about my son. They told me things like, your son is getting behind in his reading skills. Some kids are late bloomers. Don't worry. Your son's immature, but we're not worried. We noticed your son would rather play alone and he's not making friends. He's frequently bullied. He needs to learn how to stand up for himself. The list of his deficits continued, but I always explained it away, saying, he's young for this grade. He'll catch up. I was a special educator, but it never occurred to me that my son would have a disability. I believed that if I loved him enough and provided a safe home environment, he would come around to normal. Did you notice that I put air quotes around normal? I bought into the belief that we want all children to be normal, to follow teachers' directions and get along with peers and be like everybody else. But I was also his Cub Scout leader, and I saw how he interacted with other kids and how they interacted with him. And I knew that I had to shape the environment in order for him to have successful peer relations. I was relieved in the 5th grade when he discovered the joy of science fiction and his reading jumped to that 12th grade level. There were other signs of his giftedness too, and I thought we were out of the woods. And then I got that call from the school that they wanted to hold an IEP meeting. They wanted to do some testing to see if he qualified for special education services. My world came crashing down. An avalanche of negative self-talk overwhelmed me. Was it my fault? What had I done wrong? What had I failed to do? I knew very well how this played out. I pictured myself sitting at that IEP table that, as it happened later on, I questioned all my hopes and dreams for his future. And I thought about how differently people would interact with me if my own son had a disability. Somehow it was a failing of mine. Most families experience something like that when they learn their child has a disability. Where are they when that happens? Thank heavens, after the evaluation was completed and before that awful IEP meeting at school A, the psychologist met with me in his office and I heard my son's diagnosis, sensitively and privately delivered with a box of tissues nearby. What if it had been at that awkward IEP table or over the phone? How can we be sensitive to families' needs at that moment? The stigma of disability has a long tradition from ancient times when cripples and freaks were banished and sacrificed. They were shunned as though their conditions were contagious. Historically, there was a shame in having a disability or having a disabled child. For many years, they were not educated. It wasn't until 1975 that we had a public law requiring the education of all children. I remember I was in my 5th year of teaching. My mentor, Art Nuremberg, used the term culture of crippleness to name what I'm describing here. It's a culture of deficits and disability. It steals joy and saps energy, and it's a place of lost dreams and hopelessness. So when we apply our first 3 mindset tips, seeking to understand families' concerns, listen like you care, and assume best intentions, we might need to ask ourselves, is this family struggling with, coming to terms with their child's disability? Some experts say that learning to accept their disability is like the stages of grief. And I've listed on here the stages of grief. Sometimes it's written as 4 stages. Think about the families you've interacted with. If they're in one of these stages, they may have strong emotional reactions to you. They may strike out, but it may not have anything to do with you. Would you relate to a family differently if you were aware of these stages? We know that adults need processing time to integrate new information or new perspectives. So I'm going to pause for 1 minute to give you a chance to reflect on the 3 tips related to mindset. Seek to understand family concerns, listen like you care, and assume best intentions. You can use the planning tool or simply jot some notes for yourself. Consider your current practices. Where do you already have these mindsets in place? And what ideas do you have to make changes? So I'm going to be quiet for 1 minute. Okay, hope that was enough for you to jot down your notes. We're moving on to the next 2. Mindset lays the foundation for all the rest of the tips. Tip 4, and 5 are the context for working with families whose children receive special ed service. Remember, the dual capacity building framework states that all family engagement should be tied to student learning. Similarly, I'll say all family engagement for families of special needs kids should be tied to learning and the purpose of IDEA. So let's review the purpose. The purpose of IDEA says to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education, we sometimes call that FAPE, that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. Remember our earlier discussion about self-determination and supporting students to become causal agents in their learning and their life? It's anchored in the special education law. What do we do within the IEP process? Let me oversimplify it here, viewed through a parent's eyes. We determine eligibility, we find a baseline, we set goals, we plan special ed services and supports, we decide the placement, we monitor and evaluate their progress. Now, let me ask you a mindset question. How often do we go through these procedures as though we are the deciding voice? How are we doing at incorporating the first 3 mindset tips into the IEP process? Now, we've talked about special education service. What is that? So I'm coming from the lens of a parent. What do we mean? Well, the 2004 IDEA law says the IEP will specify specially designed instruction. And here's the definition. I'm just going to read the first part. Specially designed instruction means adapting as appropriate to the needs of an eligible child, a child with disabilities, the content, the methodology, or the delivery of instruction. Notice it says this SDI is individualized to the needs of an eligible child, so that the child will have access to the general curriculum. We want children with IEPs to meet all the standards of the general curriculum. The law invites the IEP team to determine what each child will need so that it will be possible. What specially designed instruction can supplement, not supplant instruction so that the child can access the general curriculum? So what does that mean? How familiar are you with the Endrew F Supreme Court decision of March 2017? Please write in the chat a 1 if you've never heard of it, 5 if you're an expert at it. I'm curious what background you have. We have a 4, 4, 4, 1, okay. Most people have some background at least. Well, let me give a little background with several more ones. So let me start with a little background. The case started with Endrew F as a 4th grader with autism in Douglas County, Colorado. He exhibited problematic behaviors, screaming and climbing and eloping from the classroom and the building, and he had fears of common things like spilling milk. The school proposed a 5th grade IEP similar to the IEPs he had had in the past, and the parents judged that his progress had stalled. So they took him out of school and transferred him to a private school at their own expense. The new school instituted a behavior plan and academic goals with much higher expectations, and Endrew made progress. Then parents planned to return him to the public school. And the school said, great, we already have a draft IEP for the 5th grade. And they wanted to use that original draft with those low expectations they had before. The parents argued, this is a denial of FAPE. This is not giving my child appropriate education. And the school argued he had been making minimal progress over the years. And after all, he has a disability. Basically, the court ruled on 3 questions. What do we mean by special education service, and how much progress should we expect, and how much should families be involved? Well, there are 2 findings that are relevant for us here. First, that IEP teams must offer an IEP reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress in light of that child's circumstances. And second, the IEP team must take steps to ensure meaningful parent involvement in IEP meetings and ensure that their opinions are considered in establishing their child's goals and services. So our recent, the Supreme Court decision requires us to rethink how we write IEPs and how we engage families in the process. Our recent pandemic shutdown has brought this issue to the forefront. So what does the Endrew F decision mean for schools? If we're going to ensure meaningful family involvement in the IEP process, we won't simply draft an IEP based on what was written last year. We will partner with families all along the way. We won't simply ask parents their concerns at the beginning of the annual IEP meeting so that we can write something in the meeting minutes. We will build a relationship with families from the start based on respect and a sincere intention to hear that family's perspective. We also won't clutter the IEP with a confusing tangle that families can't sort out, or educators for that matter. Do you see the tangle of wires in this picture? Remember when I was talking about my son's IEP meeting? When I was assigned to the hot seat, remember they had a reading goal and their response to my request for a behavior goal? What if instead we had collaborate to describe my son's driving need? That's the term I heard from David Bateman, the special ed professor and administrative law judge who co-authored the publications on special education legal issues that are published by the Council for Exceptional Children. What is a driving need? In a nutshell, it's the one thing that if we supported that child's growth, it could impact everything. Yes, there may be several goals that we'd like to see on the IEP, but which one is the driving need? What if we could support the student to succeed in one area? What would it be? For one student with a reading and learning disability, it might be reading comprehension skills. For one with attention deficit who's often distracted, it might be focus. For one who has acting out behaviors, maybe related to the trauma events of the past year, it could be self-regulation. For one who gets overwhelmed by multi-step instructions, it might be self-management and prioritizing. Ask the parents that question. I bet they'll know. They might not use the most sophisticated vocabulary, but they know. If that team had asked me, I would have said peer relations for my son. What if he had learned peer relations in middle school? How would it have changed his life? Once you've clarified the driving need, the next question is how much growth we expect. You heard the Supreme Court set ambitious expectations. Dan Rather said, the dream begins most of the time with a teacher who believes in you, who tugs and pushes and leads you on to the next plateau, sometimes poking you with a sharp stick called truth. It could be families who believe in the dream. Wherever it starts, we need to be unified in our support of that student. So yes, we'll set high expectations and we'll support parents together so we can build a positive network of support focused on possibilities, not disabilities. The Supreme Court didn't give us a standard for ambitious. They didn't want to say every student should make growth, 1 year of growth each year. Some students will make less, some will make more. Remember, IEP stands for Individualized Education Program. What if your team does an effective job of identifying the driving need and the student makes remarkable growth? The key is not to limit how far they can go. Now, I'm looking at the time and I'm going to skip over this story, but this was a team where the school asked me to have this student, help this student who wanted to be a director choose a more realistic post-school goal. Oh, you can imagine my response to that. Now, I'm concerned about giving you another pause and reflect moment. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to move on to the next. We've talked about the context and we're going to move on right to the next one. I'm going to skip over the timer. Now we're ready for the strategy, tips 6, 7, and 8. We have our mindset right. We've identified a context for working together to help that child and his driving need move forward with high expectations. We are motivated to work together as a team. Now, we have to talk about strategy. How are we going to move forward? These 3 parts of strategy are interconnected, but to work with families, we need to make sure they know the differences. To untangle some of the confusion, I think it's helpful for families if we make a distinction between the student's IEP goal that we're aiming for, and second, the intervention that teachers, therapists, paraprofessionals, counselors will implement to achieve that goal. What strategy are they going to use, and how can families be involved with that? And third, the progress monitoring. How are we going to measure progress? So if we had a goal to expand my son's interpersonal skills, we'd need to select an intervention that would work. And then we need to have a plan to monitor his progress. Selecting the intervention and planning the progress monitoring are two different questions. We need two different answers, and we need to have families involved with us as we're making those decisions. Have you ever thought about the terms we use when we're talking about support options for families? Look at this list. We talk about present levels, we talk about services, we talk about interventions. We use accommodations and modifications almost like it's a run-on word. Do families know that accommodations and modifications are very different in the special ed law? Do the professionals that work with them, are they able to explain the differences? And what about high leverage practices? When families sit with us at the IEP table, whether it's in person or virtual, do they have the basic understandings of this vocabulary so they can engage in productive discussions with us? They don't need to get a degree in special education, become certified. They have plenty to offer. They're the parent. They know their child. At our second session, you will hear from a district that provided families the background information they'll need and questions to ask during that IEP process. So why is this important? Here's a study I found during my doctoral research. Morningstar, Turnbull, and Turnbull created 3 focus groups of students at the high school level at 3 different high schools. They brought together students with a whole range of disabilities, and they asked them, what transition activities has the school offered to you? And the students listed things like career interest tests and job shadowing and employer guest speakers and mock interviews and work experience. They said, great, were those experiences valuable or not? What do you think? The students that had the same activities, and this happened in all 3 focus groups, split into 2 groups. Half the students said, oh, they were really valuable. And half of them said they were meaningless. And when they probed deeper, they found that the students who thought they were valuable had parents at home that said, I'm so glad the school is doing this with you. The students that said they're meaningless had parents at home that said, they shouldn't be pulling you out of class to do those activities. You need to be working on your academics. In other words, it's critical that we ensure families, all families, know what students are learning, why we're teaching what we're doing, why we're using the approach we're using. Just sending home a list of our curriculum isn't the same thing if we want families to endorse the learning opportunities. Now, I want to share one more story with you. This is a chance encounter I had that profoundly impacted me. It was an August day, a neighborhood backyard party. And I remember clearly speaking to a young woman who had just moved into the neighborhood. She kept looking over at my shoulder, and I turned to see what she was looking at. And she said, oh, I'm sorry, my son has Down syndrome and I have to keep an eye on him. And at that moment, her son was climbing up the slide while there was a whole line of kids climbing up the ladder on the other side. Off she went. But I talked to her later and I said, I can't believe that there was a child with a disability in the group and I didn't notice. And I said, so how is this for you? And she said something I've never forgotten. She said, when my son was born, I gave up my career as an attorney. For the last 3 years, he has been my life and my delight. Teachers and therapists have come to my home. They have taught me how to support him. Now that he's 3, they're telling me, put him on the bus and trust them. They're telling me, cut the apron strings. I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I'm ready to let go. Let that sink in. Are we really giving parents that message at age 3? Because at the secondary transition age, we say, come back, we need you to be partners. So we need to do something different about partnering with families all the way along. And I think the Endrew F decision is going to push us in that direction. So Let's talk about how to use family reinforcement as we support our students to reach their targeted destinations. We develop a strategy, don't we? One that fits the student, addresses his driving need and the circumstances. And then we want to make sure that it's, quote, reasonably calculated to enable the child to make progress. How do we do that? In 2017, a few months before the Endrew F Supreme Court decision, the Council for Exceptional Children announced a publication of 22 special education high leverage practices. These were the practices that leaders in the field identified as critical for special educators, and special ed preparation programs across the country changed their programs to make sure special educators were proficient in these. So there are websites that provide more information for special educators and other practitioners. Special educators use that collection of high leverage practices and corresponding evidence-based practices, and then they use data assessment to determine the ones they're going to fit. How can we ally with families in this process? We can learn a lot from colleagues in the early childhood field, like the story that I just shared with you. Suppose in the K-12 world, the IEP team made sure that families knew what intervention was going to be used with their child. So the parents would be prepared when the child came home and said, today, some lady took me in the back and showed me some cards. What if your child said that to you? What's going on? Wouldn't it be great if the parents could say, oh, that's wonderful, honey. She's teaching you some tricks so you can become a stronger reader. If the parent is unaware, what is she going to say? So there are ways that we can help families prepare to support the work that we are doing. And then making sure families know the measurement and the indicators and how they can reinforce. Once we've agreed on the intervention, we want to make sure we're all rowing in the same direction. Can you picture what would happen if each of the women on this team chose to row in her own way? If they need to somehow develop a system, that doesn't mean they all have to have the same strength, but we at least shouldn't be getting into each other's way. I'm going to skip over this pause moment and move quickly. And I see, is our time up, Robin, or should I keep going for a few more minutes? What do you recommend?
We still have time. It's 4:28 now. We've got time to keep going.
Oh, I looked wrong at the clock. I thought that we were down to the last couple of minutes. Okay. Okay, so, well, I'm going to do this and then we'll come back and we'll give you a pause moment at the end. Now, the last two tips, evaluation. In addition to setting ambitious expectations and providing evidence-based interventions so the students can achieve them, we'll need some method for progress monitoring, right? If you're a special educator, I'm sure you spend a major portion of your time collecting data and reporting it to families. In too many cases, though, teachers tell me progress monitoring takes them away from their support of students. They complain that it's meaningless paperwork that they send home. They also tell me too often parents don't even look at it. I wonder if parents know how to interpret those reports. Now, maybe that's not happening in California, but let's address some of those barriers. Special education law requires that we send quarterly reports of progress home to families. Technically, it says at the same frequency that reports go home for all students, but most schools use a quarterly report card system. Anyway, suppose Juan's family received this progress report in early February. How's that for promoting partnerships? What questions would his family have? This is his data for 9 weeks. So I'm going to invite, since we have time, to put in the chat questions you think the parents might have about this data coming home as the progress report. For those of you who can't access the visual, I'll describe what's on this slide. The green line is English language arts. During week 1 and 2, it shows 0. Then it rises gradually until week 7 with a score of 12. A slight drop during week 8 and then up to 15 for week 9. The blue line is math. It starts at a 2 and then it climbs with a setback in week 6 and up to 26 in week 8, then back to 19 in week 9. The red line is tech ed. It begins with a 4 in week 1, climbing rapidly to 27 in week 4, and then sharply drops in weeks 5 and 6, rising again to a high of 24 in week 8. So if you can't see it, hopefully you can picture kind of the ups and downs of these 3 lines. So what questions do we have? So someone says, what is the label for the y-axis? Okay. Any other questions? When did you start the intervention? What is going on in week 6? Okay. Anything else? What are the numbers on the left? Is this the number of times he advocated for himself in these classes? And what did that look like? And was it successful? I mean, these are questions professionals are asking. Can you imagine parents that are like, what, so he has a 0, he has a 26. What does that mean? So suppose I back up and tell you a different story. Juan has a visual impairment and he's hesitant to speak up or call attention to himself. He's in the 8th grade now, and the IEP team is concerned about his self-advocacy skills. They explained to his parents that next year in high school and in the future, whether he pursues college, which he's quite capable of doing, or a career, he'll need to speak up for himself when he doesn't understand a concept or the directions, or he can't see materials. This is going to be critical for his transition outcomes. The team created a sample list of self-advocacy actions that he could take in class, like these. They also planned intervention supports from professionals around him to help him develop these new behaviors. The first week, Mrs. Willard, his teacher, collected baseline data. She counted how often he took one of those 3 actions in ELA, in math, and in tech ed during that week. Now remember, classes every day, 5 days a week. The team was surprised to see how little he spoke up. In fact, in ELA, he didn't speak up once all week. In math, he advocated for himself twice. In tech ed, he spoke up 4 times. Don't you wonder how often he had difficulty seeing the screen or the text or needed a seat change? Then Mrs. Willard met with him to brainstorm the list. And they added an action that he suggested. What about, I can ask a friend? Then she passed the baton to him. Remember causal agent? And she invited him to tally how often he spoke up. So now these data may make more sense to you. But remember the Supreme Court ruling that parents must have meaningful involvement in progress monitoring. So what if I told you that Juan's family co-designed this method of data collection? Mrs. Willard was in touch with them from the start. His family knew the plan for tracking, how Juan scored a point each time he advocated for himself. They also learned that he suggested advocating for himself by asking a friend. His family was on board, and when Juan came home complaining that he couldn't see the demonstration or he didn't understand what he was supposed to do, they encouraged him to advocate for himself rather than picking up the phone on his behalf. They also knew that Miss Willard met with Juan during week 3 and invited him to track his own data. So this table wasn't a mystery when they saw it in February. With this background partnership, Mrs. Willard could have a conversation with Juan and his family about why he advocates less in English, the green line. Is it because he doesn't need to? Maybe his teacher uses universal design for learning, or he doesn't feel safe there. Now, obviously, the team will need to look at other data, his grades, teacher observations of his progress. He isn't learning to self-advocate just for the sake of advocating. He's speaking up so he can be successful in his classes, so that he can assume more responsibility for his own learning in school and beyond. By the way, somebody asked the question, don't you wonder why Juan's score in tech ed dropped between week 4 and 6? Well, it turns out Mr. Wood, his tech ed teacher, knew that Juan was on this list for students with IEPs. He knew Juan had a visual impairment, but Mr. Wood saw Juan wear glasses. So until Juan started advocating for himself in week 3 and 4, Mr. Wood didn't realize that Juan couldn't see the screen. And Mr. Wood started making the accommodations he needed to make. The most important issue isn't the data. The line doesn't have to go straight up to show progress. Much more important is the growth in Juan's confidence and his advocacy and how that impacts other indicators of success. This method of progress monitoring will spark collaborative conversations between educators and his family and put Juan in the driver's seat for developing his self-determination skills. The biggest danger as a team is to tell the family, let me know if there's anything I should know about your child's learning journey. Everyone's busy. No matter how well-intentioned, if there's not a routine structure for sharing progress as a two-way street, it won't happen. Building an alliance is an intentional process. If you heard Karen Mapp or Michelle Brooks discussing the dual capacity building framework, I'm sure you heard them say that family engagement must be systemic. There must be procedures and routines so that professionals and families have regular two-way communication. Come to think of it, none of these 10 tips can be successful without two-way meaningful communication, starting with interacting with families with an open mindset, truly listening to them, with a commitment to understand, care, and assume the best intentions, establishing a context for interactions based on that student's current driving need and high expectations for how far he can go, working collaboratively to develop a strategy based on evidence-based practices, a method for tracking, and a plan to work together in the implementation. And finally, an evaluation method that's meaningful for all parties and can serve as a foundation to determine whether the student has made appropriate progress. Now, I said at the beginning, we humans can't change everything all at once. I don't recommend you try to implement all 10 tips at the same time. Instead, think strategically. You have here 10 points of entry. What is your biggest concern around special education effectiveness? Think about the IDEA indicators and your local data. Which indicator or indicators would you most like to improve? How could they be improved by aligning with families using the tips for mindset, student growth, context, mutual strategic planning, and co-evaluating meaningful data? We've come to the last reflection moment for the 2 tips related to evaluation, or look back over any of the tips. And rather than give you 1 minute, I'd like to invite you to post your takeaways in the chat for all you've heard here and all 10 tips. What's one thing you could do to expand the effectiveness of family alliances where you work? Meanwhile, Robin, are there any questions? Well, let me do the last slide and then we can go to questions. I'm going to close. I do want to come back, seek to understand. Thank you, Bianca. I'll close with this quotation by Helen Keller. Alone we can do so little. Together we can do so much. Maybe together we can build strong alliances. Maybe we can discover how much easier it is when we work collaboratively, rowing the boat in the same direction. Maybe together we can empower students to develop self-advocacy skills. Maybe together we can change the statistics for employment in this country. Okay. I see no questions. Okay. Clarifying support options. Yes, to clarify support options. Debbie says, I will continue to talk with the LEAs in our, I don't know what SELPA stands for, but to encourage parent engagement. And this will be an agenda item in our monthly special ed directors meeting. Yay, great. I'm curious to hear how that goes. Well, Robin, let's let you go to this slide.
Okay. Thank you, Amy. So we wanted to just quickly highlight upcoming professional learning opportunities launching this fall that will be part of the Family Partnership Mastermind Initiative, which will have a focus on special education. So we're looking at hosting some webinars and supports that explore varied aspects of family engagement and invite in some leaders with knowledge on the topic from not just California, but other states Through our statewide work, we have been gathering topics and areas of need and interest related to special education and families, and this is ongoing work. So we always love your input and ideas, and we will look for those as you include them in part of your evaluation that you'll get from today's event. Amy, did you want to share some of those additional resources?
Sure.
Okay.
My website, which is A.Pleet-Odle, has a section called resources, and you'll see here 6 different pages of Google document. Each document has a little screenshot and a description and a link. And the center one is on my favorite family and community engagement resources. And these are amazing tools and free resources that I think you'll find valuable. It actually is 23 pages long, but it's divided into 4 categories. So don't go there unless you have time to browse, because people tell me they go there and it's like they're caught forever. And then also we have a list of references that we'll be sending out to people. And this is my contact information. And then we will go to the last slide.
Let's see, I'm going to go ahead and drop the link in the chat here for our evaluation. So if you just take a few minutes to fill that out, it's very brief, but it just lets us know some things that were helpful from today and also looking forward. So you'll see that in there, and that's for this part 1. So just a reminder to join us for part 2 of this webinar series, and that is a practitioner panel conversation, lessons learned, which will be facilitated by Amy, and that is going to be on June 8th, 3:30 to 4:45. And if you've registered for this one, you're already registered for that one, but feel free to invite others to register. They can certainly come on in, and we'll look forward to continuing this work at that time. Thank you, Amy. Thank you to the interpreters today, and thank you everyone for joining us.
And the recording of today's presentation will be available. Can you say again where they can access it?
We will be sending out the recording of today later on after we wrap it up, and then we will also be posting it on our Seeds of Partnership website. So in lieu of slides and sending all those out, it's part and packaged into the recording. So thank you again, everybody.
Thank you so much for being here.